thank you to everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate the opportunity to engage with the market in this way. So I'm just going to today talk us through Police Scotland's plans for putting in place a new framework for event and operation catering. I wanted to give you a quick overview. I know you will all know exactly who Police Scotland are, but we are a huge organisation established back in April 2013, responsible for the policing across the whole of Scotland. So there's over 28,000 square miles of the country to be policed. That's a third of the United Kingdom's landmass, and we have a unique range of urban, rural, island and remote communities. So there's a big challenge there for one force. We're the second largest force in the United Kingdom with 22,000 officers and staff. There are 13 local policing divisions, and each area has obviously got very different local needs. But for the purposes of this contract, we have one main need, and that is feeding officers when they're on operations. So I just wanted to show you the spread of divisions across Scotland. As you can see, there's vast differences in size geographically. What the map won't show you is the differences in population spread. And that in turn can lead to a concentration of large-scale policing operations in certain areas, such as Glasgow and Edinburgh. So we have, as I said before, very differing needs in different parts of the country. So in Glasgow and Edinburgh, our operations tend to be quite high volume, and our catering needs reflect that. Whereas in other parts of the country, we have maybe much smaller, more localised need. But what we are trying to do is put together a framework that addresses all of that, and ensures that officers are adequately fed during all operations, regardless of size. So basically, what we're looking at is the opportunity, the necessity, the need to feed officers when they're deployed on an operation. This gives you a wee sort of the scope of the procurement, gives you a wee sort of rundown of what we're talking about. So it's basically if an officer is required to remain in one position throughout the entirety of their shift, if they're required to work for more than 5 hours at an event, or if they're deployed on an operation or event outside of their normal working hours and usual working area. Often in operations, we are moving police staff around the country. So, and you know, we might even be bringing officers up from another part of the UK. So they would all be, they'd always have a need to be fed while they're on duty. So the events are things like football matches, concerts. They can take place weekly, or they can be a one-off. Packed lunches are the main way that we feed officers. So there is sometimes a need for hot food, but I think we'll end up covering that in a different framework, a different contract at some stage. So basically the meal needs to provide adequate nutrition for officers, and also adequate satisfaction, because they're, you know, working a long shift and often outside. They're healthy men and women who will have, you know, healthy appetites. The shifts can involve long periods of standing outdoors, sometimes wearing a heavy uniform. For example, some of them might have riot gear. And they can be called upon for sudden exertion. So the meal needs to, the content of the meals need to address the requirements of the officers. The meals usually eaten prior to the event, but we often have small items like cereal bars that can be pocketed for later consumption. So this is basically what we're saying the content of the meals should look like. We got some dietitians at University of Glasgow to do a piece of work for us a couple of years back to look at the nutritional requirements of a working packed lunch. And they suggested pretty much what you can see on screen just now. They suggested a lunch which provides between 500 and 800 calories, with about 50 to 60% of the energy coming from carbohydrates, and it should be filling and satisfying. It's obviously not practical or necessary to meet all the body's micronutrient requirements over a 6-hour period, but we want to use a variety of ingredients. They recommend items of fruit and nuts, However, in practice, we know that often the fruit's left uneaten. As I said before, we do also have requirements for hot food. So that could maybe form the part of, instead of a sandwich or wrapper roll, we could have like a breakfast roll with bacon, sausage, or a vegetarian option. So I suppose what we're here to talk about today is what we are planning to put in place going forward. But a very good question is, why have we been doing this without a contract in place? Obviously, public sector procurement in Scotland takes place within a framework of rules and regulations. Everything we do is governed by the Procurement Reform Act, and we have a set of regulations that we run all our procurements by. We need to ensure value for money for the public purse. We want high professional standards, and we need to make sure that we are meeting the relevant legal requirements. So to make sure that there are compliant contracts in place with multiple suppliers. So the short answer to the question is we do have a small number of catering contracts already in place. For example, we have got a contract for packed lunches at the moment in G Division, and that's obviously the Greater Glasgow area. Now that contract is being reviewed at the moment and is due to be renewed, but we haven't quite made a decision on what we're doing with that. We're probably going to put something in place for a 12-month period while we make further plans for this Scotland-wide framework. So there are contracts in place. We also sometimes for operations can put retrospective awards in place, and that can be as a result of short notice need due to public safety. And the text on the slide basically just shows you the part of the regulations that we use to allow us to contract suppliers without going through the full tendering process. So for our new framework, we have a few objectives. So basically, as I said, we want a compliant contract in place. We want a compliant and quick process so that when we have both planned and short notice events, we have contracts that are ready to go. We want to know what the pricing is. We want agreed pricing so that we can more effectively budget for operations and deliver best value for the public purse. We want all operations to be able to access vetted suppliers. I'll talk about vetting a wee bit later on, but basically we want to make sure that we have suppliers already pre-vetted who are able to respond to our needs at very short notice. We want to make sure that everyone is pre-qualified, and that's part of the framework. If any of you have been involved in tenders before, you'll know that there is a specific part of the tendering process that asks for all your financial information and so on. We want to make sure that we have pre-qualified suppliers who are on that framework who can respond to individual needs going forward. We want to develop contacts within the organisation so that we can discuss our needs more effectively and sort of more quickly build up good relationships with suppliers. So the opportunity, though geographical based, we do recognise that within Glasgow and Edinburgh, we might be looking at larger organisations who can offer this type of the supply to us, but we're also looking for small and medium-sized organisations, and we want to structure our framework so that the small and medium-sized organisation can sit alongside the larger suppliers. And sustainability, I think Chris is going to talk a wee bit about sustainability in a minute, so I won't go into that too much, but obviously that's something that's important to us across the board at Police Scotland. So moving on, we anticipate that we will put in place a framework that will have about 7 lots. The lots will be split geographically. There will be more than one supplier appointed to each lot. Our own agreement means that we can tailor the requirements. There are lots of frameworks out there already that we could call off from, but really what we need is our own framework that we can tailor according to the geographical need across Scotland. So as I say, I think what we're looking at is a framework to cover all 13 divisions, although, as you'll see in a minute, I'm lumping some of the divisions together into one lot. The requirement will translate into a specification that has geographic lots and I've lost my place, sorry. So I'll talk a little bit more about the actual practicalities of the service, and Chris will come in on that as well. But it is likely that we will see a wide range of operational needs. So, for example, in some areas we could have a catering order for less than 10 people as a kind of one-off for an operation, whereas in other operations have huge requirements, and there could be hundreds of officers per day over operations lasting more than 10 days. So we really need to kind of focus down into what we need in different areas at different times and create a framework agreement that covers all of that. So as I say, we plan to award for an initial 2-year period, multi-supplier, multi-lots, and there will be possible extensions beyond that of 2 12-month periods, dependent obviously on need, budget and satisfactory service delivery. So the lots at the moment, for the time being, this is what I think the lots will look at like. This could change, and as I said, this is primarily for the provision of cold packed lunches with maybe super breakfast rolls as options where possible. We are aware that often we might need more substantial hot options, especially on larger, longer term operations, but that'll probably be covered at a later stage. Suppliers will be able to bid for and be awarded more than one lot. So there's no restriction on how many lots you can bid for. And as I say, we'd hope to see bids from a range of sizes of supplier, from the small sandwich shops right through to the larger catering operations. So at this point, I'm going to pass over to Chris Thompson, Inspector Chris Thompson, and he is going to tell you a wee bit about the reality and practicalities of the requirement. So over to you, Chris.
That's great, thanks Yvonne. So just a quick introduction. So I'm the Inspector of Operations and Events Planning for Glasgow. We're by far the busiest area, and I've got a team of sergeants and officers who plan the events. We have hundreds of events every year. Not all require catering, but a significant number do. So I've just split it down very quickly into challenges and practicalities. And again, any questions towards the end that we can offer specifically. One of our greatest challenges is short notice operations and events. This can be for a kind of major incident or a protest which comes in with short notice, and again sometimes that's less than the contracted period. However, we are quite flexible in that regard, but we could come to a supplier and say we know it's out with the contract timescales, but what could you supply to us tomorrow for 100 officers, for example, and we could be flexible in that regard, but that can happen on occasion. One of our biggest challenges is the size of operations. So if you think of a large football match or a large event, we've got officers deployed for 24 hours in that period. So what we can request regularly is different offices at different times for deliveries. And that's partly because we have a kind of lack of refrigeration and officers deploying from different locations. So we have previously said, can you deliver to these 3 offices at 7 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and 9 o'clock, and that covers all of the several hundred officers, but saves us storing the food. The return of equipment to suppliers, so that's been a challenge previously that we've faced. So what we do look at is sustainable but recyclable packaging. So if a supplier uses like trays or plastic trays that they look to get back, we do facilitate that, but in the same token, preferably if it's recyclable, then that's preferable, because what we don't want is suppliers' equipment going missing. For our logistics teams, a challenge we've had previously is the food being clearly labelled, and that's in relation to the shelf life, the storage requirement, and the ingredients. So if it's for a dietary requirement, being easily labelled is good for us, because then we can we can distribute it easily rather than having to go into a bag or into a package to look to see what is actually being provided, to make sure that we're not supplying it to someone with a dietary requirement. At all stages of the process, we're looking to reduce our waste, unused items, reuse items where possible. So again, individually packaged items is preferable, because then we can either store it correctly and redistribute it. And again, we look outside. So sometimes if I've got a lot of leftover food, we look to food banks or to other charities that we can provide that to, as long as it's been stored correctly, just so we're in keeping with our sustainability. The practicalities, so that again, that probably falls into the delivery to different offices at different times. As I say, Yvonne's already covered, it's a vast requirement from officers who are carrying out public order duties. So to officers standing in cold stadiums or cold events for long periods of times. So we try to request food specific to the event, and that's how our request could vary. We do try and give as much notice as possible. So a lot of our events are quite far in advance, and we would engage with suppliers early just to let them know our requirements, and just to see what we could best be provided. I've already covered it, but we are looking to suit all needs, tastes, and dietary requirements. That's really difficult when you're dealing with hundreds of officers. But again, it's just about trying to reduce that overall wastage. It might be built into the contract, but we do look for a kind of emergency contact or out of hours. So if we have asked for a delivery at 4 o'clock on a Friday and the officers turn up and it's not there, we do look for a means of contacting someone. It might have been delivered to the wrong location or left with someone who it's not normally. So again, it would just be for that level of contact. And the two final parts are kind of a good feedback process. In the past, especially with new suppliers, we like to provide valuable feedback, so it allows you to better run your operation, or feedback, something worked well, something didn't work well. So it's just to build into that, to an ongoing process throughout the contract. And again, finally, just if it was hot food, ideally takeaway disposable items, so that we're not having to think about returning stuff to suppliers, or to we could dispose of it sensibly. But that's all from myself. So if you have any questions, please ask later on. Is there anything else, Yvonne, from our perspective?
No, that's fine. That's great, Chris. And a lot of what you just said, I'm going to sort of touch on a wee bit more. I've pulled out some figures and things from past operations, so we can sort of demonstrate what we're looking at. So thank you very much for that. So as I say, just moving on, I thought it would be sensible to sort of talk you through the differences in locations of staging posts and numbers of officers and types of catering required by looking at some actual examples from previous operations. So the first one that I want to talk about is Operation Unicorn, which was the response to the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and the policing requirement for that. So this was obviously a huge operation, one of the largest Scotland-wise to date. When we talk about staging posts, just for some of you who maybe aren't familiar with the term, we're basically talking about locations where officers sort of are meeting before they go out onto the deployment, before they're deployed out onto their shift. So basically that could be here at Dalmarnock in the police headquarters, or it could be at Hampden Stadium, it could be at a school or a council building, somewhere in a rural location. And basically that's where everyone will muster to basically get their requirements for the shift. They will pick up their hot lunch or lunch packs there. So when I talk about a staging post, that's really what I mean. So for Operation Unicorn, there's approximately 14,000 officers deployed all over Scotland. As you can imagine, that was a huge exercise in planning in terms of making sure everyone had transport and catering. So the operation lasted over 10 days. And obviously, although we have some contingency planning in place at Police Scotland, there wasn't really advance warning of when the operation would start. So we had to move pretty quickly on that. This shows you examples of contracts that we had to put in place retrospectively for this operation. So basically, again, talking about the staging coaches posts at Aberdeen. So we had breakfasts and lunches required there. You can see the numbers over the course of that 10 days, 926 breakfasts, 1,579 packed lunches and 653 hot meals. So we did that through one of the larger catering organisations. At Dundee and Angus College, we actually used the college catering. Again, quite a sizable requirement there, with the hot meals and sandwich packs being in hundreds. And then at City of Edinburgh at Waverley Court, the council again stepped in and helped us with the venue catering there. And you can see that, you know, there was a huge concentration of staff in the Edinburgh location. So well over 5,000 meals over 10 days, well over 5,000 hot meals and 5,665 sandwich packs. So that was a huge undertaking. And we put in place just a memorandum of understanding with City of Edinburgh Council for that, because we didn't have time, obviously, given the nature of the operation, to go out to tender or get quotes. We had to negotiate at the time of the operation. So we will seek quotations from individual catering companies and so on to make sure we are getting value for money. But really, when short notice, when the operations are planned at short notice, availability can often be a deciding factor for us. Obviously, we're aware that availability at short notice is not always the best option for value for money for us. So again, this is why we want to get this framework in place, so we have suppliers on our books ready to go. So next operation is Operation Luanchik. I hope I've said that properly. And that's the response to the UCI World Cycling event. So that ran in August 2023 over another 10-day period. It was Glasgow based, but there was also activities in Highland and Islands, Dumfries and Galloway, Lothian Borders and Tayside. So this one I thought would be quite interesting to look at. There was a lot of different levels of catering required for this one. So these contracts under 5,000, these were in some of the more rural areas, and you can see, you know, maybe there was only events on certain days. So we had requirements in the hundreds for J, C and V division and N division. Then when we moved to G division, which is Greater Glasgow, we had one supplier who was, as I say, under contract with us at the time for the West of Scotland contract. And this was the requirement in Glasgow. But again, it's really interesting to look and see how the requirement can vary from, you know, up there at the top, 950 odd sandwich packs at Bellahouston Academy, down to 4 sandwich packs at Shettleston Police Station. So we are very aware that it's not one size fits all, and we have to find different types of suppliers who can respond to different levels of need. And the next one is Operation Roll, which was the policing operation relating to the visit of President Trump to Scotland in summer 2025. This one focused on locations in Ayrshire and Aberdeenshire. However, officers were mobilised from all 13 divisions, and we also had to cater for some officers who were brought into Scotland under mutual aid from other forces in the UK. The catering for this operation was vast, as you can imagine, over £160,000 spent over the course of a couple of weeks, packed lunches and hot meals, and also vouchers issued for certain restaurants and other cafes, and we had catering vans in place at some of the staging posts as well. So again, really quite a vast requirement. And although we had some notice that this operation was going to take place. I'm calling it short notice because we didn't get confirmation of the dates until quite late in the day. So although we were planning for this for, I suppose, maybe about 6 weeks, in terms of knowing what we would need for catering and transport and so on, we didn't actually get confirmation until about a week before the President was actually arriving. So again, our needs are, I mean, I fully accept it sounds like we're a pain in the neck to work with, and we can be, because we change, our needs change at very short notice. Obviously, maybe if planning or intel has changed on an operation, we might shift the focus from one area to another. So we do need suppliers who can be flexible with us and can respond to changing needs. So our requirements for the actual tender itself, Chris touched on this. Basically, we would hope at a minimum to be making bookings day 1 for day 3 delivery. We would actually hope to be much better than that. The standard we would aim for would be to have a five working days notice. But as I said, there will always be short notice requirements. Chris also touched on the hours. We can require out of hours deliveries. We can require things to be changed out of hours. We can require the initial order to be put in at very short notice in the early hours of the morning for the following day. So there's a lot of kind of unknowns, and we need that flexibility. Our estimated quantities are usually based on what we know from previous operations, but again, this can change at short notice because of intel or planning. So in short, there's times when we just have to move the goalposts a bit, and we require that flexibility from our suppliers. Obviously, we would build in certain kind of protection, as in if we have ordered food for day 1 for day 3, and the operation stands down, we would still pay for confirmed bookings within that time frame. But we might have ordered for 10 days and we stand down on day 3, and then we would probably have some agreement in place that we would only pay for catering booked up to day 5 and expect to be able to cancel days 6 to 10 without any charge. But that's all kind of part of the contract management going forward. Chris also touched on our issues with storage. So at many of the staging posts, we don't have access to fridges. So we do need to make sure that the products that are being delivered are appropriately packaged and that the temperature is controlled during the transportation process. We don't like to have food sitting about, obviously, for too long. So we want our delivery times to be as flexible as possible, and potentially 2 or 3 deliveries in one day for the larger operations. We've found in the past that caterers who use third-party couriers for delivery can't give us that degree of flexibility. So we're really looking for people who are sort of in control of their own delivery mechanisms. So want to just touch on a few other requirements. Subcontracting is allowed, it is permitted, but it needs to be declared in advance. So subcontracted suppliers are subject to the same vetting and other requirements. I'm sorry, I've just flicked forward. Obviously, because of the nature of what we do, there will be a lot of confidential information being shared, and you would be required to sign non-disclosure agreements for certain operations, because basically we don't want information about, you know, where you're delivering to, what it's for, what's going on, getting out into the public domain. Obviously, there are legislative requirements in terms of catering. So in the contract, when the specifications complete, we will have the minimum compliance with health and safety and food and hygiene regulations. But I'm sure it won't be anything you're not used to working with already. And quality assurance, we would expect you to have appropriate operational policies, procedures and practices in relation to food safety and hygiene standards, and how you manage your organisation in place, and that would be required at the time of tendering. So police vetting, I just want to touch on this briefly. As you can imagine, that is an absolute deal breaker when it comes to working with Police Scotland. When the tender goes out, when we issue the invitation to tender, we do send out the declaration of non-involvement in serious organised crime, and there are two other pieces of paperwork that go out with the ITT that you'd be expected to complete. It's usually only the supplier and subcontractors, as in directors and people who are running the business, who get vetted. But in some situations, we might ask for delivery drivers as well. But that would be in certain situations with certain operations where we would want more assurance that the people who are working for you are trustworthy and understand the importance of the job they're doing. Vetting can take a wee while. It can take, depends on how busy the team are. If it coincides with a new intake of police officers coming in, then we could wait longer, or it can sometimes come through in a couple of days. It just depends. The vetting requirements, if you're under contract with us already, are refreshed every 3 to 5 years. And you would have to fill in the original paperwork again to go through the vetting process at that time. So we would expect, when we award our contract, we would expect each lot to be ranked by most economically advantageous tender. We would have two methods of call off from the framework. For low value, probably under 5k, we would just do a direct award. So if an operation is being planned and we know the value of our catering is less than £5,000, we would be able to award directly to the first ranked supplier on that lot. And if they can't obviously deliver our requirement, we would move on to the second or third ranked. For higher, more complex requirements, so probably over 5 to 10,000, we would probably run another mini comp, again through PCS, which we'll talk about in a minute, and we would invite all suppliers on each lot to submit a bid for the mini competition. So we plan to publish our tender around about August 2026. The tender will run for 6 weeks. It'll be open for 6 weeks. I think Fran might be able to give us some more details, but we will do SDP will do a seminar on supporting suppliers in the tendering process. There is a question and answer facility built in the tendering process, and that closes 1 week before the deadline. We would expect tenders to be in by October 2026. As I said, the tendering portals we're going to use are Public Contract Scotland and Public Contract Scotland Tender, PCST. So the first port of call is PCS, Public Contract Scotland. So please make sure your company registration is up to date on there. I've included the link for that. It's really, really important that you are able to see the tendering opportunities when they come out, and that means selecting the correct CPV codes when you register. What I'll maybe do is send through a list of the CPV codes that we will be using for this tendering opportunity. So make sure you've selected all of those. I think company registrations can lapse after 12 months. So even if you think you are registered in PCS, please check, because that is where we will be basically advertising the tender. So with the tenders the bids will be submitted through PCST, which is a separate linked site. So you need to sign up for both of those. The reason we use PCST is because it gives us a better audit trail for a tender of this complexity. And I appreciate that PCST is maybe not a system that is familiar to small and medium-sized organisations. However, again, there is support from the Supplier Development Programme to help you with that. So once the tender closes, we will evaluate the bids. That takes between 4 to 6 weeks. There may be clarifications required, so we might come back to you and ask for a clarification on some information you've submitted. We would then have to go through the vetting process that I've just described. So it would be probably around about December 2026 before we're actually awarding this framework. But as I say, that's dependent on a number of factors, some of which are out of our control. The structure of the tender is, I think, fairly straightforward. You'll receive the invitation to tender documents, and that will detail all the requirements and weightings. It will include the non-collusion certificate, the SOC certificate, and the security aspects letter for vetting purposes. The technical part of the ITT will basically focus on what you can tell us about how you plan to meet our requirements. So there is a page limit on that, and please stick to it, because we policy is to disregard any pages in excess of the limit. I would urge you to not be put off by the tendering process. Do answer the questions and use plain English. We're not looking for lots of kind of, you know, fancy submissions. We just want to know how you can provide this service for us, and what you can do, how you're going to do it. There'll also be questions on Fair Work First, which will focus on your management of your workforce. So we want to see things like no inappropriate use of 0 hours contracts, what you do to tackle the gender pay gap, and create a more diverse and inclusive workplace. But again, that's all spelled out in the invitation to tender itself. And we will expect a question on sustainability. So I would anticipate that the tender itself will have probably 4 or 5 questions. 3 of them will focus on how do you plan to respond to our requirement, and then there'll be a question on Fair Work First and a question on sustainability. I've just included this slide on the scoring matrix, just so I'm not going to talk through that just now, but just so you have that for reference, about how we will score the technical elements. And then there will be a commercial envelope as well. We will ask for a fixed rate table, and then we will ask you to respond to 2 weighted scenarios for each lot that you're applying for. So we'll basically give you a scenario of number of items we want to order, when we want them by, what the delivery location is, and we want you to respond to that using your listed rates, and tell us how you would build in any contingency for changes. And that's pretty much everything I've got to say about our tendering opportunity. I do recognise that we've kind of waffled on for quite a wee while, and there's a lot to take in. You will get a copy of the slides, but now's the time if you've got any specific questions for either Chris or myself. Please go ahead and ask.